Maggie Duval dares the impossible, offering $500 to tame her late husband's fierce stallion. But when a familiar cowboy rides back into her life, the real challenge begins. Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. The morning sun beat down on Maggie Duval's shoulders as she stood on the front porch of the sprawling ranch house. At 28, she was the youngest widow in Clearwater County, and certainly the wealthiest. Not that money brought her any. "Comfort these days, Mrs. Duval," a voice called from the barn. "He's broken through again." Maggie sighed and adjusted the black lace of her mourning dress. 6 months since Harold's passing, and she still wore black from head to toe. Not out of love, God knows there hadn't been much of that between them, but because it kept people at a distance. And distance was what Maggie needed most these days. "Coming, Frank," she called back, gathering her skirts and marching toward the commotion. The sight that greeted her was becoming all too familiar. A section of the corral fence lay splintered on the ground, and 3 ranch hands were frantically trying to corner the massive chestnut stallion who stood proudly in the middle of the pasture, nostrils flaring, muscles rippling under his gleaming coat. Devil's Lantern, Harold's prized stallion, the horse no one could tame. "That's the second fence this week, Mrs. Duval," said Frank, wiping sweat from his brow. "And Joe's got a busted arm from trying to saddle him yesterday." Maggie stared at the magnificent animal. Harold had paid a small fortune for him just weeks before the heart attack that took his life. "He'll bring fine foals," her husband had boasted. But so far all Devil's Lantern had brought was trouble. "He's eating through our profits faster than a termite through pine," Frank continued. "Begging your pardon, ma'am, but maybe it's time to sell him." Harold wanted that horse, Maggie said firmly, though she knew Frank was right. The ranch was her responsibility now, and sentimental attachments to a wild stallion were luxuries she couldn't afford. The horse reared up, his front hooves pawing at the air as if challenging her decision. The ranch hands backed away nervously. Something inside Maggie snapped. She was tired of being afraid, of the horse, of the future, of the whispers in town about the young widow who couldn't possibly manage the Double D ranch on her own. "Get me the ledger, Frank," she said, her voice steady, "and tell everyone to gather here in an hour." Back in the house, Maggie reviewed the ranch's finances at her husband's massive oak desk. The numbers didn't lie. Between the broken fences, the medical bills for injured ranch hands, and the special feed Harold had insisted on for his prize stallion, Devil's Lantern was becoming a costly problem. An hour later, Maggie stood on the front porch steps, facing her assembled ranch hands. 20 men in dusty hats and worn boots looked up at her with a mixture of curiosity and concern. "As you all know," she began, "Devil's Lantern has been more trouble than he's worth, but instead of selling him, I've made a decision." She straightened, her back, channeling every ounce of the strength she'd had to find since Harold's death. $500 to any man who can break him," she announced. The men exchanged surprised glances. It was a small fortune for most of them. "And if you try and fail, don't come back bleeding on my porch." There were a few nervous chuckles. $500 was nearly half a year's wages for a ranch hand. "Mrs. Duval," Frank said carefully, "that horse has already injured 5 men. Maybe it's best to—" $500, Maggie repeated firmly. "Any takers? Over the next 2 weeks?" Maggie watched from her porch as man after man tried to tame Devil's Lantern. Some were ranch hands from the Double D, others were self-proclaimed horse whisperers from neighboring farms. One was even the preacher's son, who ended up with a broken collarbone for his trouble. The townsfolk began to talk. They said she was being cruel, offering money for what seemed like an impossible task. They said she'd grown cold since Harold's death. Too proud, too strange. Maggie didn't care. The truth was, watching these men fail to tame the wild stallion gave her a strange sense of satisfaction. Devil's Lantern was as untamable as she felt. On the 15th day, Maggie sat in her rocking chair on the porch, a cup of coffee growing cold beside her, when a lone rider approached the main house. He rode with an easy confidence, his back straight, his movements gentle with his mount. Something about him seemed familiar, but Maggie couldn't place him. As he drew closer, she felt her heart skip a beat. It couldn't be. The man dismounted in one fluid motion and tied his horse to the hitching post. He was lean but strong, with broad shoulders beneath a worn leather vest. His face was tanned from the sun, with lines around his eyes that hadn't been there before. Eyes the color of smoke after a storm. Cal Rowan. Memories flooded back. Cal had worked at the Double D years ago, mucking stalls and helping with the horses. He'd been quiet, hard-working, and Maggie now remembered with a flush, handsome in a way that had made her heart race even then. But Harold had fired him after catching Cal teaching Maggie how to saddle a horse one afternoon. Not knowing his place, Harold had called it. Now here he was, standing at the bottom of her porch steps, looking up at her with those same grey eyes. "Mrs. Duval?" he said, tipping his hat. "Mr. Rowan," she replied, finding her voice. "It's been a long time." "Yes, ma'am." He glanced toward the corral where Devil's Lantern was circling restlessly. "I heard in town you're offering $500 to anyone who can break that stallion." Maggie nodded. "That's right. Though I should warn you, he's already sent 6 men to Doc Thompson with various injuries." A ghost of a smile played across Cal's lips. "I didn't come for the warning, ma'am." Without another word, he turned and walked toward the corral. Maggie found herself rising from her chair, drawn to follow him. By now, a small crowd of ranch hands had gathered. They'd seen enough failed attempts to be skeptical of any newcomer, but there was something different about the way Cal approached. "The fence, that's Cal Rowan," she heard one of the older hands mutter. "Heard he went off to war after Harold fired him. Came back different. Different how?" Maggie wanted to ask, but she kept her silence, watching as Cal climbed the fence and dropped down into the corral. Devil's Lantern immediately noticed the intruder. The stallion's head came up, ears pinned back in warning. He pawed the ground, sending dust flying. "Be careful, mister," someone called out. "He'll charge in a heartbeat." But Cal didn't seem concerned. He stood perfectly still in the center of the corral, his eyes never leaving the horse. When he finally moved, it was slowly, deliberately. He took off his hat and set it on a fence post, then removed his vest and draped it beside the hat. The stallion snorted and took a few steps forward, muscles tensed for a charge. Cal spoke then, his voice too low for Maggie to hear the words, but the tone was gentle, almost hypnotic. He stood with his hands hanging loosely at his sides, making no move toward the horse. For nearly an hour, nothing seemed to happen. Cal stayed in the center of the corral, occasionally speaking softly, occasionally shifting his position slightly, but never approaching the stallion. Devil's Lantern circled warily, sometimes coming close enough that Maggie's heart jumped to her throat, other times retreating to the far side of the enclosure. The ranch hands began to drift away, bored with the lack of action. Even Frank muttered something about wasted time and headed back to work. But Maggie stayed, rooted to her spot by the fence, unable to tear her eyes away from the quiet drama unfolding before her. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the yard, Cal finally moved toward the horse. Not directly, but at an angle, his eyes still fixed on the animal. Devil's Lantern tossed his head and backed away, but didn't charge. "He's gonna get himself killed," muttered one of the few remaining spectators, but Maggie wasn't so sure. There was something about Cal's approach, patient, respectful, almost as if he and the horse were having a conversation no one else could hear. When darkness fell completely, Maggie reluctantly returned to the house. From her bedroom window, she could see a lantern hanging on the corral fence. In its glow, the silhouette of a man stood sentinel in the center of the enclosure, still waiting, still watching. The next morning, Maggie woke before dawn and hurried downstairs, not bothering to pin up her hair or change out of her nightgown and robe. From the kitchen window, she could see Cal still in the corral, sitting now with his back against the fence, seemingly asleep. Devil's Lantern was at the opposite end, watching him. After hastily dressing, Maggie brought a tray of coffee and breakfast to the corral. Cal was awake now, still in the same position, his eyes on the stallion. "You'll need your strength," she said, passing a plate through the fence rails. Cal looked up at her, surprise flickering across his features. "Thank you, Mrs. Duval." "You stayed all night," she observed. He nodded, accepting the coffee. Seemed important to let him know I'm not going anywhere. Something about his words made her throat tighten. Most men would have tried to rope him by now. "Most men try to break a horse's spirit," Cal said, his eyes returning to Devil's Lantern. "I'm just trying to earn his trust." Throughout the day, Maggie found excuses to pass by the corral. Each time, the scene was much the same. Cal, patient, and still the stallion, wary but increasingly curious. By mid-afternoon, Devil's Lantern had ventured closer, occasionally lowering his head to sniff the ground near where Cal sat. That evening, as Maggie brought another meal to the corral, she found Cal standing in the center, his hand extended, palm up. Devil's Lantern stood just a few feet away, nostrils flaring as he scented the air. "He's considering it," Cal said quietly as Maggie approached. "Deciding if I'm worth the risk." Maggie set the tray down on a barrel. "And are you? Worth the risk?" Cal's eyes shifted to her, and something in their depths made her breath catch. "That's not for me to say, ma'am, but I believe some risks are worth taking." She wasn't sure if they were still talking about the horse. On the third day, Maggie woke to an unusual sound: silence. The normal morning chorus of ranch activities was strangely absent. Throwing on her robe, she hurried to the window and saw a cluster of ranch hands gathered at the corral, all of them stock-still, as if afraid to break a spell. Maggie dressed quickly and made her way outside. As she approached the corral, the men parted silently to let her through. What she saw made her stop in her tracks. Cal was standing in the center of the corral, one hand resting lightly on Devil's Lantern's neck. The stallion stood perfectly still, his head lowered, eyes half closed. There was no saddle, no bridle, just man and horse in perfect, peaceful communion. As she watched, Cal whispered something in the horse's ear, then smoothly swung himself onto the stallion's bare back. Devil's Lantern's ears flicked, but he remained steady. "Well, I'll be damned," Frank whispered beside her. Slowly, Cal guided the horse into a walk, then a trot, circling the corral with nothing but the pressure of his legs and soft words to direct the animal. Devil's Lantern responded as if they'd been partners for years. After a few minutes, Cal brought the stallion to a stop near where Maggie stood. For the first time since he'd arrived, she saw him smile fully, a warm, genuine expression. That transformed his serious face. "I believe you owe me $500, Mrs. Duval," he said, his voice light with gentle teasing. Maggie felt a smile tugging at her own lips. "It seems I do, Mr. Rowan, though I must say, you've earned every penny." Cal dismounted and led Devil's Lantern to the gate. The ranch hands backed away, still wary of the horse that had caused so much trouble, but the stallion followed Cal docilely, like a faithful dog. "I'll have your money ready this afternoon," Maggie said as Cal latched the gate behind him. He nodded, then hesitated. "If it's all the same to you, Mrs. Duval, I'd like to stick around for a few days. Make sure he doesn't revert to his old ways once I'm gone." "Of course," Maggie replied, perhaps too quickly. "We have a spare room in the bunkhouse." "Thank you, ma'am." Cal touched the brim of his hat, then led Devil's Lantern toward the barn, the once fearsome stallion now following like a gentle shadow. As Maggie watched them go, she felt something shift inside her, like a door long locked suddenly creaking open. For the first time in months, maybe years, she felt a flicker of curiosity about what tomorrow might bring. That night, Maggie sat alone at her dining table, pushing food around her plate without eating. Her mind kept returning to the image of Cal with Devil's Lantern, the gentleness in his hands, the patience in his eyes. A knock at the door startled her from her thoughts. When she opened it, Cal stood on her porch, hat in hand, looking freshly washed and slightly uncomfortable. "Evening, Mrs. Duval. I hope I'm not disturbing you." "Not at all," she said, suddenly conscious of her plain black dress and tightly pinned hair. "Is everything all right with Devil's Lantern?" "He's settled in fine. Cal shifted his weight. "I came for the money." "Oh, of course." Maggie felt her cheeks warm with embarrassment. She'd completely forgotten about the reward. "Please, come in. I'll get it for you." She led him to Harold's study and opened the safe hidden behind a painting of cattle grazing. The stack of bills was ready. She'd counted it out that afternoon. "Here you are, Mr. Rowan, $500 as promised." She held out the money, but Cal made no move to take it. "I didn't ride for the gold, Mrs. Duval," he said quietly. "I rode for a chance to ask you something I've been holding in since I mucked your stalls." Maggie felt her heart begin to race. "Ask what?" Cal took a deep breath, his gray eyes never leaving hers. "Your hand." The room seemed to tilt around her. "My hand," she repeated, not sure she'd heard him correctly. In marriage, Cal clarified, his voice steady despite the bold request. I know it's sudden and probably unwelcome, but I've carried you in my heart since the day I left this ranch. Maggie stared at him, stunned into silence. She remembered Cal from before, the quiet boy who never looked her way. Or maybe he had, and she'd just never let herself see it. You think breaking a horse means you can handle a widow? She finally managed, her voice sharper than she intended. No, ma'am, he said, hat pressed to his chest. But I'm willing to earn both the same way, with patience, with respect, and by never walking away. The sincerity in his voice made her throat tighten. This man standing before her was not the shy, stable boy she remembered. War had changed him, hardened him perhaps, but there was a depth to him now that drew her in despite her reservations. Mr. Rowan, Cal, she began, not knowing what to say. You don't need to answer now, he said quickly. I know it's a lot to take in. I just wanted you to know why I really came back. Maggie nodded, grateful for the reprieve. What will you do now? Cal placed his hat back on his head. I meant what I said about staying a few days. After that, I suppose it depends on your answer. After he left, Maggie stood in the study for a long time. The unclaimed money still in her hand, her mind racing with possibilities she hadn't allowed herself to consider in years. Outside, the stars appeared one by one in the darkening sky. And for the first time since Harold's death, Maggie Duval found herself looking up at them with something that felt dangerously like hope. The next morning, Maggie woke before sunrise. Sleep had been elusive, her mind replaying Cal's unexpected proposal over and over. She dressed carefully, choosing a black dress that was simpler than her usual morning attire, and pinned her hair with less severity than usual. In the kitchen, she found Mrs. Peterson, the housekeeper, already preparing breakfast. You're up early, Mrs. Duval, the older woman commented, eyeing Maggie's appearance with poorly concealed curiosity. Lots to do today, Maggie replied vaguely. Is there coffee? Fresh, pot on the stove. Mrs. Peterson sliced bread for toast. Heard about that cowboy breaking Devil's Lantern. Quite the miracle worker, they're saying. Maggie poured herself a cup, avoiding the housekeeper's probing gaze. Yes, Mr. Rowan has a way with horses. Handsome fellow too, Mrs. Peterson added, casually. Frank says he knew you before when your husband was alive. He worked here briefly, Maggie confirmed, her tone discouraging further questions. She took her coffee to the porch, needing space from the housekeeper's prying eyes. The ranch was coming to life around her. Men moved between the barn and the bunkhouse, voices calling out morning greetings. And there, by the corral, stood Cal, watching as Devil's Lantern trotted around the enclosure. Before she could talk herself out of it, Maggie crossed the yard toward him. Cal turned at her approach, tipping his hat. Morning, Mrs. Duval. Good morning, Mr. Rowan. She handed him a cup of coffee she'd brought along. I trust you slept well? Yes, ma'am. Better than I have in a long while. He accepted the coffee, with a nod of thanks. And you? Well enough. She turned her attention to the stallion, who nickered softly at the sight of Cal. He seems different this morning. He just needed someone to listen to him, Cal said, his eyes following the horse. Most creatures do. The simple wisdom in his words struck Maggie. When was the last time someone had truly listened to her? About yesterday, she began hesitantly. Your question, Cal shook his head gently. You don't need to answer yet. I meant what I said about giving you time. Maggie nodded, relieved yet somehow disappointed at the same time. What are your plans for today? Thought I'd work with Devil's Lantern some more, then maybe check your south fence line. Frank mentioned it needed repairs. You don't have to do that, Maggie said quickly. You're not a ranch hand anymore? Cal finished for her, a small smile playing on his lips. No, ma'am, I'm not. But I've got two hands that are willing to work and idle. Hands never suited me. Maggie found herself smiling back. Well, if you insist, I won't stop you. But you'll join us for supper tonight, at the main house. It wasn't a question, but Cal answered anyway. I'd be honored. Throughout the day, Maggie found herself watching Cal from various windows of the house. She saw him working with Devil's Lantern, introducing a saddle, speaking constantly to the horse in that same low, soothing voice. Later, she spotted him riding out with Frank and two other hands, toolboxes and fence posts loaded in a wagon behind them. It felt strange having him back on the ranch after all these years. Strange, but not unwelcome. That evening, Maggie took more care with her appearance than she had in months. She chose a dress of dark blue rather than black, still respectful for a widow, but not quite as severe. She even added a small cameo brooch at her throat, a piece her grandmother had given her that had long remained in a jewelry box. When Cal arrived for supper, he'd clearly made an effort as well. His shirt was clean and pressed, his hair neatly combed. He'd even shaved, revealing a strong jawline that had been partially hidden by stubble before. "You look lovely, Mrs. Duval," he said simply as she led him to the dining room. "Thank you," she replied, feeling a warmth in her cheeks that had nothing to do with the summer heat. "And please call me Maggie. Mrs. Duval makes me feel like my mother-in-law." The ghost of a smile touched his lips. Maggie, then. Dinner was a surprisingly comfortable affair. Cal spoke of his time after leaving the Double D, how he'd joined the army, served overseas, seen things that had changed him forever. He didn't dwell on the horrors of war, but Maggie could see them reflected in his eyes when he thought she wasn't looking. "And after the war?" she asked, as Mrs. Peterson cleared away the main course plates. "Drifted for a while, worked ranches from Texas to Montana." Cal accepted a slice of apple pie. "Never stayed in one place too long." "Until now," Maggie observed. Cal's eyes met hers. "Until now." After dinner, they moved to the porch. The summer night was warm, cicadas singing in the darkness beyond the pool of lamplight. They sat in rocking chairs, the gentle creak of wood the only sound between them for several minutes. "Why did you really come back, Cal?" Maggie finally asked, her voice quiet in the darkness. Cal was silent for so long that she thought he might not answer. When he did, his voice was low and thoughtful. "I heard about Harold's passing. Felt like maybe it was time to come home." "This was never your home," Maggie pointed out. "No," Cal agreed, "but you were always where I wanted to be." The simple honesty of his words took her breath away. "You barely knew me then." "I knew enough," he said. "I knew you were kind when most weren't. I knew you were trapped in a marriage that wasn't right for you. And I knew that someday, if I was patient enough, I might get a chance to show you there was another way to live." Maggie gripped the arms of her rocking chair. "You make it sound so simple." "It is simple," Cal replied. "Not easy, but simple. I care for you, Maggie. Have for years. If you can find it in your heart to give me a chance, I'll spend every day trying to be worthy of it. If not, I'll ride out and trouble you no more." Put that way, it did seem simple, yet Maggie's heart raced with doubt and possibility. "I need more time," she whispered. "Take all the time you need," Cal said, rising from his chair. "I've waited this long. I can wait a bit longer." He bid her good night and walked down the porch. Steps, his figure soon swallowed by the darkness. Maggie remained in her rocking chair long after he'd gone, her mind full of what-ifs and maybes. The next few days fell into a pattern. Cal continued to work with Devil's Lantern in the mornings, then joined the ranch hands for whatever tasks needed doing. Maggie found excuses to ride out with them, checking cattle or inspecting repaired fences. Each evening, Cal would join her for supper, and afterward they would sit on the porch and talk. She learned about his childhood on a small farm in Colorado, his parents now long dead. He told her about his dreams of someday having his own piece of land, not as grand as the Double D, but enough to raise horses and cattle and build a life. In turn, Maggie shared stories of her own youth, growing up as the daughter of a banker in a small town much like Clearwater, how she'd met Harold when he came to secure a loan for his ranch, already successful at 45 while she was just 20. How her parents had encouraged the match, seeing it as a step up for their daughter. "Were you ever happy with him?" Cal asked one evening as they watched the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink. Maggie considered the question carefully. "Content sometimes. Harold wasn't cruel. He provided well, but happy. No, I don't think I was ever truly happy." "What would make you happy, Maggie?" Cal's voice was gentle, his eyes on the distant mountains. The question caught her off guard. No one had asked her that in years, maybe ever. "I'm not sure anymore," she admitted. "I've spent so long just trying to keep everything together that I haven't thought about what I want." Cal nodded, understanding in his silence. On Sunday, they rode into town together for church services. Maggie was acutely aware of the curious glances and whispered comments as they entered the small white building side by side. The widow Duval and the drifter who'd tamed Devil's Lantern. It was the juiciest gossip Clearwater had seen in months. "People are talking," she murmured as they took their seats in a pew near the back. "Let them," Cal replied simply. "Nothing they say changes what's true." After the service, several townspeople approached them. Some were genuinely friendly, welcoming. Cal back to the area. Others barely disguised their curiosity beneath polite inquiries about the ranch. Mrs. Winters, the banker's wife and the town's most notorious gossip, cornered Maggie while Cal was speaking with the preacher. "My dear, it's so good to see you." "Out and about," she said, her eyes sharp with interest. "And with company, no less. Mr. Rowan seems attentive. He's been a great help at the ranch," Maggie replied neutrally. "I'm sure he has." Mrs. Winters lowered her voice. "Though some might think it's a bit soon after poor Harold's passing for you to be entertaining gentlemen callers." Maggie felt her spine stiffen. "Mr. Rowan works for me, Mrs. Winters, and I don't recall asking for anyone's opinion on how I run my ranch or my life." Before the older woman could respond, Cal appeared at Maggie's side. "Ready to head back?" he asked, seemingly oblivious to the tension. "Yes, I think we're done here," Maggie said, giving Mrs. Winters a tight smile before taking Cal's offered arm. As they rode back to the ranch, Maggie was uncharacteristically quiet, Mrs. Winters' words echoing in her mind. "Penny for your thoughts," Cal said after a while. Maggie sighed. "The town thinks I'm disrespecting Harold's memory by having you around." "And what do you think?" She considered the question carefully. "I think Harold and I had a business arrangement more than a marriage. I think I've paid my respects and done my duty, and I think—" "Yes?" Cal prompted when she hesitated. "I think I'm tired of living my life according to what others expect of me." Cal smiled then, a warm, genuine smile that reached his eyes. "That sounds like the Maggie I remember. The one who used to sneak out to the stables at dawn to watch the new foals before anyone else was awake." Maggie looked at him in surprise. "You knew about that? I saw you a few times. You looked so peaceful, so yourself, not the banker's daughter or Duval's wife, just Maggie." The fact that he had noticed, had seen her in those rare moments of simple joy, touched something deep inside her. That night after supper, instead of sitting on the porch as usual, a sudden summer storm drove them inside. Thunder rolled across the sky as rain pounded against the windows. "Sounds like we're in for a big one," Cal observed as they settled in Harold's, no her, study. Maggie poured them each a small glass of brandy. "The crops need it," she said, handing him a glass. "We've been too dry lately." Cal accepted the drink with a nod of thanks. As their fingers brushed, Maggie felt a jolt of awareness that had nothing to do with the lightning flashing outside. They sat before the small fireplace, the crackling flames casting dancing shadows on the walls. Cal looked different in this light, softer around the edges yet somehow more substantial than the wealthy men who had pursued her after Harold's death, men interested only in her land and money. "Tell me about the war," she said suddenly. "You never talk about it, not really." Cal's expression grew distant. "Not much to tell that's worth hearing." "I want to know," Maggie insisted gently. "I want to understand what changed you from the boy I knew to the man sitting here now." Cal stared into his glass for a long moment. "War strips away pretenses," he finally said. "Makes you see what matters and what doesn't. I watched men die for inches of mud, saw others risk everything to save a friend." He took a slow sip of brandy. "Makes things like social standing and wealth seem mighty unimportant. Is that why you came back? Because none of it matters anymore?" Cal shook his head. "I came back because you matter. Always have." Another crack of thunder shook the house, making Maggie jump slightly. Cal reached out instinctively, his hand covering hers on the arm of her chair. The warmth of his touch spread up her arm, settling somewhere in the vicinity of her heart. "Sorry," she murmured, embarrassed by her reaction to the storm. Cal didn't remove his hand. Nothing to be sorry for. They sat like that, connected by that simple touch, as the storm raged outside. For the first time in longer than she could remember, Maggie felt safe, protected not because she was someone's property, but because she was cared for. "Cal," she said quietly, turning her hand to grasp his, "I don't know if I can be what you want me to be." "I don't want you to be anything but yourself," he replied, his voice equally soft. "The woman who stands up to town gossips, who offers $500 to tame an untamable horse, who watches the sunrise with foals because it brings her joy." Maggie felt tears prick at her eyes. "I'm not sure I know who that woman is anymore." "She's still there," Cal said with gentle certainty. "I see her every day, coming back little by little." Another flash of lightning illuminated the room, followed almost immediately by a deafening crack of thunder. The lights flickered once, twice, then went out completely, leaving only the fireplace for illumination. "Well," Maggie said with a nervous laugh, "at least we have the fire." "I should check on the horses," Cal said, rising from his chair. "Devils. Lantern gets skittish in storms." "I'll come with you," Maggie decided, surprising herself. "Just let me find a lantern." They made their way to the barn through the driving rain, huddled together under a single oilskin coat Cal had grabbed from a hook by the door. By the time they reached the barn, they were both soaked despite their efforts. Inside, the horses were indeed restless, moving anxiously in their stalls. Devil's Lantern was the worst, rearing and pawing at his stall door. "Easy now," Cal said, approaching the stallion with sure, steady movements. "Just a little thunder, nothing to fear." Maggie hung back, watching as Cal soothed the frightened horse with nothing but his voice and presence. It was the same approach he'd used to tame the stallion initially. Patience, respect, an unwavering calm that seemed to communicate itself to the animal. After a few minutes, Devil's Lantern settled, nuzzling against Cal's shoulder like an overgrown pet. The other horses, taking their cue from the stallion, also grew calmer. "You have a gift," Maggie said, as Cal rejoined her in the center aisle of the barn. "Just patience," Cal replied, "and respect for their nature." Another crash of thunder made Maggie flinch. Without hesitation, Cal put an arm around her shoulders. "The storm's right overhead now," he said. "Might be best to wait it out here." Maggie nodded, too aware of his closeness to form words. They sat on a hay bale, the lantern casting a golden glow around them. Cal kept his arm around her, and after a moment's hesitation, Maggie leaned into his warmth. "When I was a girl," she said softly, "I used to dream about living on a ranch, having horses and wide-open spaces. When I married Harold, I thought I was getting that dream. But it wasn't what you expected," Cal guessed. Maggie shook her head. "Harold saw the ranch as a business, the animals as assets. I was just another acquisition, the pretty young wife to complete his success story." "You deserve better than that," Cal said, his voice rough with emotion. "Maybe I do," Maggie whispered. Outside, the storm began to move away, the thunder growing more distant. But neither of them made a move to leave the barn. In the stillness that followed the storm's passing, with only the soft sounds of horses and their own breathing, something shifted between them. Maggie turned to face Cal, really looking at him in the lantern light. The strong line of his jaw, the tiny scar above his left eyebrow, the steady grey eyes that saw her, really saw her in a way no one else ever had. "Ask me again," she said quietly. Cal's gaze intensified. "Maggie Duval, will you marry me?" This time she didn't hesitate. "Yes." The word hung in the air between them, simple yet life-changing. Cal's hand came up to cup her cheek, his touch gentle as if she might break or change her mind. "Are you sure?" he asked. "The town will talk. They'll say you're rushing, that it's too soon after Harold." "Let them talk," Maggie said, echoing his words from earlier. "Nothing they say changes what's true." Cal smiled then, a smile that transformed his serious face and made him look younger, more like the boy she'd known years ago. Slowly, giving her every chance to pull away, he leaned forward and kissed her. It was a gentle kiss, respectful and sweet, but it awakened something in Maggie that had been dormant for too long. When they finally parted, she felt breathless and more alive than she had in years. "We should head back to the house," Cal said, though he made no move to release her. "In a minute," Maggie replied, resting her head against his shoulder. "I want to remember this moment exactly as it is." They sat together in the quiet barn, surrounded by the sweet smell of hay and the soft nickering of horses. Outside, the storm had cleared, leaving behind a sky washed clean and filled with stars. And in Maggie's heart, something that had been tightly knotted for years finally began to unravel, making space for a feeling she had almost forgotten: hope. News of Maggie and Cal's engagement spread through Clearwater faster than a prairie fire. By noon the next day, Mrs. Peterson had heard it from the delivery boy, who'd heard it from the blacksmith's apprentice, who'd overheard two ranch hands discussing it at the general store. "Is it true, Mrs. Duval?" the housekeeper asked as she served Maggie lunch on the porch. "You and Mr. Rowan are to be married?" Maggie took a sip of lemonade, enjoying the rare feeling of certainty that filled her. "Yes, Mrs. Peterson, it's true." The older woman pressed her lips together. "Don't you think it's a bit hasty? Mr. Duval's only been gone 6 months." "I appreciate your concern," Maggie said firmly, "but my mind is made up. Mrs. Peterson wasn't the only one with opinions." That afternoon, Maggie received 3 unexpected visitors: Mrs. Winters, Mrs. Blake, and Mrs. Thompson, the self-appointed guardians of Clearwater's moral standards. "We've come out of concern, dear," Mrs. Winters said as they settled in Maggie's parlor, declining the offered tea. "This news about you and that cowboy." "Cal Rowan," Maggie supplied. "My fiancé." Mrs. Blake clicked her tongue. "That's precisely our concern. You hardly know the man." "I know him better than I knew Harold when we married," Maggie countered. "That was different," Mrs. Thompson interjected. "Your parents arranged that match. Harold was established, respectable. And 20 years my senior," Maggie added, "with little interest in me beyond the respectable wife I would make." The 3 women exchanged uncomfortable glances. "We're only thinking of your reputation," Mrs. Winters insisted. "People will talk. They'll say you dishonor your husband's memory, that this Rowan fellow is only after your money." Maggie sat down, her teacup with deliberate care. "I appreciate your concern, but my reputation is my own business, as is my heart." "At least wait a year," Mrs. Blake pleaded. "Complete the proper mourning period." "I've mourned enough," Maggie said quietly. "Now I choose to live." After the women left, Maggie stood at the window, watching their buggy disappear down the long driveway. She knew this was only the beginning. There would be more whispers, more judgmental glances, more concerned visitors. But for the first time in her life, she found she didn't care what others thought. The certainty of that was as exhilarating as it was terrifying. Cal found her still at the window an hour later when he came in from working with the horses. "You look like you're 1,000 miles away," he said, stopping in the doorway. Maggie turned to him with a smile, just thinking about how simple things become once you know your own mind. "Visitors?" Cal asked, nodding toward the faint trail of dust still visible on the road. "The welcoming committee," Maggie confirmed wryly. "Come to save me from myself." Cal's expression darkened. "What did they say about me?" "Nothing I care to repeat." Maggie crossed to him and, in a boldness that surprised even herself, took his hands in hers. "Nothing that matters." The worry in his eyes softened. "As long as they haven't changed your mind." "Not a chance, Cal Rowan." She squeezed his hands. "I'm not letting you go again." That evening at supper, they discussed practical matters. Cal insisted he didn't want to simply move into Harold's position, either in the house or on the ranch. "Want to earn my place here," he said firmly. "Not just step into another man's boots." "The ranch needs a foreman," Maggie pointed out. "Frank is getting older, and he's already said he'd welcome help." "I could do that," Cal agreed, "but I won't. Take your husband's study or sleep in his bed. We start fresh, Maggie. Nothing borrowed or inherited." Maggie felt a rush of affection for him. Harold had always emphasized what belonged to him: his ranch, his wife, his legacy. Cal wanted nothing that wasn't freely given. "We could renovate." "The East Wing," she suggested. "Make it ours, new furniture, new colors." "I don't need fancy things," Cal cautioned. "Neither do I," Maggie replied. "But I want our marriage to start in a place that belongs to both of us, not his shadow." Cal's expression softened. "If that's what you want, then that's what we'll do." Over the next few weeks, the Double D buzzed with activity. Maggie threw herself into renovating the East Wing, ordering new furniture from the catalogue, and hiring painters from town. If the workers were surprised by the widow's sudden burst of energy, they kept their opinions to themselves, at least while on the ranch. Cal, meanwhile, took on more responsibility with the day-to-day operations. The men respected him, partly for his quiet competence, partly for taming Devil's Lantern, and partly for winning Maggie herself, something most had considered impossible. One evening, as they reviewed the ranch accounts together at the kitchen table, Cal pointed to a column of figures. "Your cattle operation is losing money," he said bluntly. Maggie frowned. Harold always said cattle were the backbone of the ranch. "Maybe once," Cal replied, "but these numbers tell a different story. Your horses, on the other hand, especially those quarter horses you've been breeding, they're turning a solid profit." Maggie studied the ledger more carefully. Cal was right. The small horse breeding program she'd started 2 years ago, more as a hobby than a business, was outperforming the cattle by a significant margin. "I never realized," she murmured. "Harold always handled the business side." "And you trusted him to do what was best," Cal said, his voice gentle. "But sometimes we need fresh eyes to see what's right in front of us." Maggie looked up at him, struck once again by how different he was from Harold. Her late husband would have made the decision. Himself perhaps not even bothering to inform her. Cal was showing her the facts, trusting her to make her own choice. "What would you suggest?" she asked. "Scale back the cattle. Not all at once, but gradually. Redirect that money and land to expanding the horse breeding program." His eyes lit up with enthusiasm. "With Devil's Lantern as a foundation sire, you could develop one of the finest breeding operations in the territory." "We could," Maggie corrected him with a smile. "This will be your ranch too soon enough." Cal shook his head. "It will always be your ranch, Maggie. I'm just lucky enough to be along for the ride." As they planned the future of the Double D, Maggie felt a growing excitement she hadn't experienced in years. This was what partnership felt like, making decisions together, building something that belonged to both of them. Not everyone shared their enthusiasm. 2 weeks after their engagement, Maggie received a letter from Harold's lawyer in the city, requesting an urgent meeting. She and Cal rode in together the following day. Mr. Abernathy's office was lined with leather-bound law books and smelled of pipe tobacco and furniture polish. The lawyer himself, a thin man with spectacles and thinning grey hair, greeted Maggie with formal politeness and Cal with barely concealed suspicion. "Mrs. Duval, thank you for coming so promptly." He gestured to the chairs across from his desk. "I understand congratulations are in order." "Thank you," Maggie replied, taking a seat. "This is my fiancé, Cal Rowan." Mr. Abernathy nodded curtly in Cal's direction before turning his attention back to Maggie. "It's precisely this youth development that I wish to discuss with you." "I don't see how my engagement is a legal matter, Mr. Abernathy," Maggie said, her back stiffening. The lawyer cleared his throat. "As executor of your late husband's estate, I have a responsibility to ensure his wishes are carried out and his assets protected. The estate was settled months ago," Maggie pointed out. "The ranch is mine, free and clear." "Yes, but there are considerations." Abernathy pulled a document from his desk drawer. "Your husband included a codicil in his will that I feel obligated to bring to your attention under the current circumstances." "What kind of codicil?" Cal asked, speaking for the first time. Abernathy's eyes narrowed slightly at Cal's interruption. "One that stipulates that should Mrs. Duval remarry within a year of Mr. Duval's death, ownership of the ranch would be reviewed by a panel consisting of myself and 2 other business associates of the deceased." Maggie felt as if she'd been slapped. "That's absurd. Harold left me the ranch. It's mine." "Conditional upon your continued status as his widow for at least 1 year, Abernathy corrected, adjusting his spectacles. Mr. Duval was concerned that certain types of men might seek to take advantage of a wealthy young widow. The implication was clear, and Maggie saw Cal's jaw tighten. "Let me see that document," Cal said, his voice controlled but hard as steel. Abernathy hesitated, then slid the paper across the desk. Cal read it carefully, his expression giving nothing away. "This says the panel can review ownership," Cal noted after a moment. not that they automatically take the ranch away. Correct, Abernathy conceded, but given the hastiness of this engagement and Mr. Rowan's lack of means or standing, I think the panel's decision would be quite predictable. Maggie felt anger bubbling up inside her. This is nothing but Harold trying to control me from the grave. Mrs. Derval, please. Abernathy looked pained. Your husband only wanted to protect you and his legacy by threatening to take away my home if I dare to make my own choices. Maggie stood up, her hands trembling with rage. Harold didn't care about protecting me. He cared about ownership, of the ranch, of the cattle, of me. Maggie, Cal said quietly, placing a hand on her arm. Let's think this through. She turned, to him ready to argue, but the calm in his eyes steadied her. Cal wasn't backing down. He was asking her to be strategic rather than reactive. She took a deep breath and nodded. The wedding is set for 3 weeks from Saturday, Cal said, turning back to Abernathy. That would make it just shy of 7 months since Harold's passing. As I said, the codicil specifies 1 year, the lawyer replied with a hint of smugness. Then we'll postpone, Cal said simply. What? Maggie looked at him in shock. Cal's eyes met hers, steady and sure. We'll wait until after the year is up. The ranch is your birthright, Maggie. I won't be the reason you lose it. Very sensible, Mr. Rowan, Abernathy said, unable to hide his surprise. I hadn't expected such restraint. I didn't come back for the ranch, Mr. Abernathy, Cal said, evenly. I came back for Maggie. The rest is just land and buildings. On the ride back to the Double D, Maggie was unusually quiet. The summer sun beat down on them, dust rising from the road beneath their horses' hooves. You're angry, Cal finally said as they crested the hill overlooking the ranch. Not at you, Maggie replied. At Harold, at myself for never standing up. To him when he was alive. We'll wait the 5 more months, Cal assured her. It's not so long. Maggie reined her horse to a stop, forcing Cal to do the same. I don't want to wait, she said fiercely. I've spent my whole life doing what others expected of me. Being the proper daughter, the obedient wife. I'm done waiting for permission to live my life. Maggie, the ranch, is just land and buildings, she echoed his words. You were right about that. What matters is us, what we're building together. Cal studied her face. You'd give up the Double D? Everything you've worked for? If it means not letting Harold control me anymore, yes. Maggie's voice was steady, with conviction. We could start fresh, buy a smaller spread with what money I have saved, build something that's truly ours from the ground up. The look Cal gave her then was so full of pride and love that it took her breath away. You continue to surprise me, Maggie Duval. Is that a good thing? She asked with a small smile. The best thing, he assured her. But let's not be hasty. We have options besides giving up everything or waiting for Harold's deadline. What options? Cal's eyes gleamed with determination. We fight, challenge the codicil, find a different lawyer, one who's on your side, not Harold's. Hope flickered in Maggie's chest. You think we could win? I think we owe it to ourselves to try. Cal reached across the space between their horses to take her hand. I told you on the day we met that I'd never walk away. I meant it. That night, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, a rider approached the ranch house. It was Thomas Jenkins, the young lawyer who had recently set up practice in Clearwater, challenging Mr. Abernathy's decades-long monopoly on legal matters in the county. Evening, Mrs. Duval, Mr. Rowan, he said, tipping his hat as he dismounted. Hope I'm not intruding. Not at all, Maggie replied, curious about this unexpected visit. What brings you out to the Double D? Jenkins looked slightly uncomfortable. Word gets around in a small town. I heard you had a meeting with Abernathy today about a codicil in your late husband's will. Cal rose to his feet. News travels fast. Abernathy's clerk is sweet on my secretary, Jenkins explained with a small smile. Professional confidentiality isn't what it should be in Clearwater. And you've come to offer your services? Maggie guessed. Jenkins nodded. I've had my share of disagreements with Abernathy's interpretations of the law. If you're looking for a second opinion, I'd be happy to review the documents. Maggie glanced at Cal, who gave a slight nod of encouragement. "We'd appreciate that. Mr. Jenkins, would you care to join us for coffee while we discuss the details?" As the evening progressed, Maggie's spirits lifted. Jenkins was young but sharp, pointing out several weaknesses in the codicil that Abernathy had conveniently failed to mention. "The language is vague," he explained, poring over the copy of the document they'd obtained. "It says the panel can review ownership, but doesn't specify on what grounds they can actually change it. And the fact that Abernathy himself is named as one of the panel members, that's a clear conflict of interest." "So you think we have a case?" Cal asked. Jenkins looked up with a confident smile. "I think Abernathy is counting on intimidation rather than solid legal footing. If you're willing to fight, Mrs. Duval, I believe we can win." For the first time since their visit to Abernathy's office, Maggie felt the weight lifting from her shoulders. "I'm willing to fight, Mr. Jenkins, more than willing." The next few weeks were a whirlwind of activity. During the day, Maggie and Cal continued their work transforming the ranch, shifting resources from cattle to horses, renovating the east wing of the house, building their future together piece by piece. In the evenings, they often met with Jenkins, preparing their case against Harold's codicil. The town continued to buzz with gossip about them, but Maggie found it bothered her less and less. She had stopped attending church services after several uncomfortable encounters, but one Sunday she surprised Cal by putting on her best dress. "I thought we were skipping town today," he said, as he watched her pin up her hair. Not in the severe style she'd worn during mourning, but in a softer arrangement that framed her face. "I'm tired of hiding," Maggie replied, meeting his eyes in the mirror. "This is our town too, and I want everyone to see that their disapproval hasn't changed a thing between us." Cal's smile was slow and warm. "Have I told you lately how much I admire you, Maggie Duval?" "Not since yesterday," she teased, rising to straighten his tie. "But I never tire of hearing it." Their entrance to the church caused the expected stir, but Maggie held her head high, her hand resting in the crook of Cal's arm. They sat in the same pew she had occupied with Harold for years, enduring the stares and whispers with dignified silence. After the service, as they made their way outside, Reverend Thomas approached them. The elderly preacher had baptized Maggie as a baby and had performed her wedding ceremony to Harold 7 years earlier. "Mrs. Duval, Mr. Rowan," he greeted them with a nod. "It's good to see you both today." "Thank you, Reverend," Maggie replied cautiously, unsure of his intentions. The old man's eyes were kind as they rested on her face. "I understand congratulations are in order." Before Maggie could respond, Mrs. Winters appeared at the Reverend's elbow. "Surely you don't approve of this hasty engagement, Reverend?" Poor Harold barely cold in his grave. Reverend Thomas turned to the busybody with surprising firmness. "It is not our place to judge the timeline of another's heart, Mrs. Winters. The Lord sees not as man sees. Man looks on the outward appearance, but the Lord looks on the heart." Mrs. Winters' mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. Maggie felt Cal's hand tighten around hers. "Thank you, Reverend," Cal said quietly. The old man nodded. "When you're ready to set a date, my door is always open." As they drove home in the buggy, Maggie leaned against Cal's shoulder, a feeling of peace settling over her. "I didn't expect that," she admitted. "People can surprise you," Cal replied, his arm around her. "For better or worse?" "Lately, it's been for better," Maggie said, smiling up at him. The following week brought another surprise. Maggie was in the barn with Cal, discussing plans for expanding the horse breeding facilities, when Frank hurried in. "Riders coming up the road," the foreman announced. "Looks like Mr. Abernathy and 2 others." Cal and Maggie exchanged concerned glances. They weren't due in court for their challenge to the codicil for another 3 weeks. "I'll handle this," Cal said, but Maggie shook her head. "We'll handle it together." They walked out to the front of the house just as 3 men on horseback arrived. Abernathy was indeed one of them. The other 2 Maggie recognized as business associates of Harold's, Samuel, Whitney, a cattle buyer, and James Morrison, who owned the bank in the next county over. "Mrs. Duval," Abernathy greeted her stiffly. "Mr. Rowan, I believe you know Mr. Whitney and Mr. Morrison." Maggie nodded coolly. "What brings you gentlemen to the Double D?" "We've come to conduct our review as specified in Mr. Duval's will," Morrison said, his tone businesslike. "Our court date isn't for 3 weeks," Cal pointed out. Abernathy's thin smile didn't reach his eyes. "This is separate from your legal challenge. The codicil gives us the right to review the ranch operations at any time if we have concerns about its management." "And what concerns might those be?" Maggie asked, fighting to keep her voice steady. Whitney cleared his throat. "We've heard disturbing reports about changes being made, selling off cattle, focusing on horse breeding instead, renovations to the main house. These aren't decisions Harold would have approved." "Harold is dead," Maggie said bluntly, "and I am making the decisions that are best for the ranch's future." "That's precisely what worries us," Abernathy interjected. "These changes began after Mr. Rowan's arrival. It appears our fears about undue influence were well-founded." Cal stepped forward, his voice level but with an edge of steel. "The changes were Maggie's decisions based on the ranch's financial records that show the cattle operation was losing money while the horse breeding program was turning a profit." "May we see these records?" Morrison asked, his banker's interest piqued. "Of course," Maggie replied. "If you'd care to step inside, I have them ready." This wasn't entirely true. She hadn't expected this visit, but she had been reviewing the books regularly with Cal and knew exactly where every figure stood. For the next 2 hours, the 3 men pored over ledgers and receipts while Maggie calmly answered their questions. Cal remained at her side, occasionally offering clarification, but mostly letting Maggie take the lead. It was her ranch after all, and no one knew its operations better than she did. "I must say, Mrs. Duval," Morrison said finally, looking up from a column of figures, "these numbers are quite impressive. The horse breeding program shows remarkable growth." "That was Maggie's initiative," Cal pointed out. "Started 2 years ago, well before I returned." Whitney nodded reluctantly. "And the cattle reduction appears to be strategic rather than wholesale, culling the less productive herds while maintaining the bloodlines Harold valued." Abernathy looked less convinced. "The renovations to the house, however, are being paid for with my personal savings," Maggie interrupted. "Money left to me by my grandmother, not part of the ranch assets." The lawyer's mouth thinned in displeasure. He clearly hadn't expected Maggie to be so well prepared or so confident. "Well," Morrison said, closing the ledger in front of him, "I, for one, am satisfied that the Double D is being managed capably, perhaps even more profitably than before." Whitney nodded in agreement. Harold was set in his ways. Sometimes fresh eyes see opportunities others miss. Abernathy looked from one man to the other, clearly displeased by their assessment. "The codicil also concerns Mrs. Duval's personal decisions, which are none of our business," Morrison cut in firmly. "The ranch is thriving, that's all we were asked to review." As the 3 men prepared to leave, Morrison hung back, letting the others mount their horses first. He turned to Maggie with a small smile. "For what it's worth, Mrs. Duval, Harold and I didn't always see eye to eye. He was a shrewd businessman but a controlling husband. It's good to see you coming into your own." Maggie blinked in surprise. "Thank you, Mr. Morrison." "And Mr. Rowan," Morrison added, turning to Cal. "Keep encouraging her independence. It suits her." They watched the 3 men ride away, Abernathy's back stiff with displeasure, the other 2 conversing easily. "What just happened?" Maggie asked, a bit dazed by the unexpected turn of events. Cal slipped an arm around her waist. "I believe you just won your first battle, Mrs. Duval." "We won," she corrected him, leaning into his embrace. "Together." That evening, as they sat on the porch watching the stars emerge one by one, Maggie felt a sense of contentment she had never known before. The ranch was secure, their plans were taking shape, and the man beside her saw her as an equal partner, not a possession. "A penny for your thoughts," Cal said, reaching over to take her hand. Maggie smiled. "I was just thinking that for the first time in my life, I'm exactly where I want to be." Cal brought her hand to his lips. "And where is that?" "Here. With you." She turned to face him fully. "Cal, I don't want to wait anymore. Not for the court case, not for the end of mourning, not for anyone's approval. Let's get married next week, just as we planned." "What about the ranch? The codicil?" Maggie shook her head. "After today, I'm not worried. Morrison and Whitney are on our side. Abernathy can't override them both, and even if he could." She took a deep breath. Some things are worth the risk. Cal studied her face, his eyes filled with a tenderness that made her heart ache. Are you sure? More sure than I've ever been about anything, Maggie replied. I've spent too long living in fear of what people think, of losing the ranch, of being alone. I'm done being afraid. Cal pulled her gently into his arms. Then we'll be married next Saturday, just like we planned. As he held her close, Maggie looked out over the ranch. Her ranch, soon to be their ranch. The evening shadows were gathering, but for once, she wasn't afraid of the darkness. With Cal beside her, she was ready to face whatever came next. Because, for the first time since she could remember, Maggie Duval was living life on her own terms. And it felt like freedom. The week before the wedding passed in a flurry of activity. Despite Maggie's wishes for a simple ceremony, it seemed the entire town had opinions about how things should be done. Mrs. Peterson, who had gradually warmed to the idea of the marriage, insisted on baking a proper wedding cake. Frank and the ranch hands wanted to decorate the barn for a celebration afterward. Even Reverend Thomas got involved, suggesting they hold the ceremony in the church to make it proper. When did this become everyone else's wedding? Maggie asked Cal one evening, as they sat at the kitchen table surrounded by lists and notes. Cal smiled, reaching across to take her hand. People care about you, Maggie, more than you realize. They have a funny way of showing it, she muttered. But there was no real anger in her voice. The truth was, the town's attitude had begun to shift. While some, like Mrs. Winters, remained staunchly disapproving, others had come around. The story of how Cal had tamed Devil's Lantern had spread, enhanced with each telling until he was practically a folk hero. And Maggie's quiet dignity in the face of gossip had earned her respect, even from those who initially criticized her. 3 days before the wedding, a letter arrived from Mr. Jenkins. Maggie's hands trembled slightly as she opened it, Cal watching, her face anxiously. What does he say? Cal asked when she looked up. A smile broke across Maggie's face. Abernathy has withdrawn his objection to our case. The codicil will not be enforced. What? Cal took the letter, scanning it quickly. Why would he back down now? It seems Mr. Morrison and Mr. Whitney had a private conversation with him, Maggie explained, her voice filled with wonder. They convinced him that pursuing the matter would only damage his reputation, especially given how well the ranch is doing under my management. Cal grinned, sweeping her into his arms and spinning her around the kitchen. You did it, Maggie. You beat them at their own game. We did it, she corrected him, laughing as he set her back on her feet. I couldn't have done it without you. The day before the wedding, Maggie visited Harold's grave for the first time in months. She went alone, needing this final moment of closure before starting her new life with Cal. The cemetery was quiet in the late afternoon sun, birds singing in the oak trees that provided patches of shade among the headstones. Harold's monument was imposing, a large marble slab with his name, dates, and the words, "Beloved husband and respected businessman," carved in formal letters. Maggie stood before it, feeling strangely detached. This stone marked the resting place of a man she had lived with for 7 years but had never truly known, or perhaps had never been allowed to know. I'm getting married tomorrow, Harold, she said quietly. Not to please my parents or to secure my future, but because I've found someone who sees me as I am and loves me for it. A gentle breeze rustled the leaves overhead, the only response to her words. I know you wouldn't approve, she continued, but I've spent too long worrying about approval. Yours, the town's, everyone's but my own. That ends now. She placed a small bouquet of wildflowers at the base of the stone, not out of lingering affection, but as a final gesture of farewell to a chapter of her life that was closing. Goodbye, Harold, she said simply, then turned and walked away without looking back. When she returned to the ranch, she found Cal in the corral with Devil's Lantern. The once wild stallion now followed Cal like a faithful hound, responding to the slightest cue from his voice or hands. How did your visit go? Cal asked as she approached the fence. Maggie leaned against the weathered wood. It was peaceful, like saying goodbye to someone I used to know a long time ago. Cal nodded, understanding in his eyes. And now? Now. I'm ready for tomorrow, she said with a smile. For us. The wedding day dawned clear and bright, the kind of perfect late summer day that seemed made for new beginnings. The ranch was transformed. Flowers decorated the porch and pathways, tables were set up under the trees for the celebration afterward, and a simple wooden arch stood in the front yard where Maggie and Cal had decided to exchange their vows. Her bedroom. Maggie prepared with the help of Mrs. Peterson and Sarah, a young woman from town who had become something of a friend in recent weeks. "You look beautiful," Sarah said as she helped Maggie with the final touches of her hair. Maggie studied her reflection in the mirror. She had chosen a dress of soft cream rather than the traditional white, its simple lines flattering without being showy. Her hair was arranged in loose waves around her face, with a few wildflowers tucked in rather than a veil. "Do you think it's too simple?" she asked, a rare moment of uncertainty creeping in. Mrs. Peterson sniffed, but there was affection in her eyes. "It's perfect. You look like yourself, not like someone playing dress-up." A knock at the door revealed Frank, looking uncomfortable in his Sunday best. "Everything's ready, Mrs. Duval. Guests are arriving, and the Reverend's here." "And Cal?" Maggie couldn't help asking. Frank's weathered face softened into a smile. "Waiting for you. Nervous as a cat in a room full of rocking chairs, but he's there." Maggie took a deep breath. "Then I guess it's time." Frank offered his arm with awkward gallantry. "Would you do me the honor of letting me walk you down, Mrs. Duval, seeing as there's no family to do it?" Tears pricked at Maggie's eyes. "I'd be honored, Frank, and please, it's Maggie. Just Maggie today." Downstairs the house was empty, everyone having gathered outside for the ceremony. Through the windows Maggie could see a surprising number of people, not just the ranch hands and a few friends, but what looked like half the town. "Word got around," Frank explained, seeing her surprise. "Folks wanted to see the woman who tamed Devil's Lantern's tamer." Maggie laughed, her nervousness fading. "Well, let's not keep them waiting." As Frank led her through the front door and onto the porch, a collective murmur went through the gathered crowd. Maggie barely noticed, her eyes fixing immediately on Cal, who stood waiting beneath the wooden arch. He looked different today. Still Cal, with his quiet strength and steady gaze, but transformed by the new clothes he wore and the emotion plainly visible on his face as he watched her approach. Next to him stood Devil's Lantern, his coat gleaming. In the sunlight, saddle polished to a high shine. The symbolism wasn't lost on anyone present, the wild stallion now standing docile beside the man who had earned his trust through patience and respect. The walk from the porch to the arch seemed both endless and over in a heartbeat. Frank placed Maggie's hand in Cal's with a gruff, "Take care of her," then stepped aside. "You're beautiful," Cal whispered, his eyes never leaving her face. "So are you," Maggie replied with a smile. Reverend Thomas began the ceremony, his voice carrying clearly across the yard. He spoke of love and partnership, of building a life together founded on mutual respect and shared dreams. The traditional words took on new meaning for Maggie as she stood beside Cal, feeling the rightness of this moment in every fiber of her being. When it came time for the vows, Cal surprised her by speaking from his heart rather than repeating the standard phrases. "Maggie, I promise to stand beside you, not in front of you or behind you, to respect your strength while offering my own, to listen when you speak, and to hear what remains unspoken, to face whatever comes our way together, as partners in all things. This I vow for all the days of my life." Tears filled Maggie's eyes as she responded with her own words. "Cal, I promise to trust you with my heart as I've trusted no other. To face each day with the courage you've helped me find in myself. To build a life that belongs to us both, founded on honesty and respect. To love you freely and fully, without fear or reservation. This I vow for all the days of my life." The simple gold bands they exchanged were warm from the sun and from being held tightly in nervous hands. When Reverend Thomas pronounced them husband and wife, the cheer that went up from the gathered crowd startled a flock of birds from a nearby tree. Cal kissed her then, a kiss that managed to be both gentle and filled with promise, mindful of their audience, yet hinting at the privacy to come. When they turned to face the crowd as Mr. and Mrs. Rowan, Maggie felt a surge of joy so powerful it almost took her breath away. The celebration that followed was unlike anything the Double D had ever seen. Tables groaned with food contributed. by townspeople. Even Mrs. Winters had sent a ham, though she herself was conspicuously absent. Music from fiddles and guitars filled the air as the afternoon stretched into evening, and lanterns were lit to illuminate the impromptu dance floor, set up near the barn. As twilight deepened, Maggie found a moment to slip away from the festivities. She made her way to the small rise behind the house, where a single oak tree stood sentinel. From this spot she could see the entire ranch spread out below, the house with its new east wing, the corrals and barn, the fields stretching toward the distant mountains. Cal found her there a few minutes later, 2 glasses of champagne in his hands. "Hiding from our guests?" he asked, handing her one. Maggie shook her head. "Just taking a moment to see it all clearly, our home." "Our home," Cal repeated, savoring the words. "Has a nice ring to it." They stood in companionable silence, sipping their champagne and watching, as more lanterns were lit below, creating pools of golden light in the gathering darkness. "Are you happy, Maggie?" Cal asked finally, his voice soft. She turned to look at him, this man who had walked back into her life and changed everything. "Happier than I ever thought possible," she answered truthfully. Cal set down his glass and took hers, placing it beside his on a flat rock. Then he pulled her gently into his arms, one hand cupping her face with infinite tenderness. "I've dreamed of this day for so long," he murmured. "Of you, of us. Sometimes I'm afraid I'll wake up and find it was just another dream." Maggie leaned into his touch. "This is real, Cal, we're real." The kiss they shared then was different from the one at the ceremony, deeper, without restraint, a promise of the night to come. When they finally parted, both breathless, the stars had begun to appear overhead. "We should get back," Maggie said reluctantly. "They'll be wondering where we disappeared to." Cal nodded, but neither of them moved immediately, reluctant to break. "This perfect moment. There's something I've been meaning to give you," Cal said suddenly. "Wait here." He jogged back down the hill, returning a few minutes later with something hidden behind his back. "Close your eyes," he instructed. Maggie complied, curious. She felt him take her hand and place something in it, something small and metal. "You can look now." She opened her eyes to find a key resting in her palm. "What's this for?" "It's the key to our future," Cal said, a hint of nervousness in his voice. "I've been saving every penny since I came back. Bought a small piece of land just beyond the north boundary of the Double D, 20 acres with a creek running through it." Maggie looked up at him in surprise. "You bought land? When?" "Finalized it yesterday. I wanted it to be a surprise." Cal's eyes were earnest in the dim light. "I know you love the ranch house and we don't have to change anything, but I wanted us to have something that was just ours, something we built together from nothing. A place where we could raise horses, maybe build a smaller house someday." Tears filled Maggie's eyes for what felt like the 100th time that day. This man understood her so completely, her need for independence, for something untainted by the past. "It's perfect, Cal," she whispered, closing her fingers around the key. "Absolutely perfect." Hand in hand, they walked back down to their wedding celebration, their hearts full of plans for the future they would build together. Autumn came to Clearwater County, painting the trees in brilliant hues of red and gold. The renovations to the east wing of the ranch house were complete, creating a space that was uniquely Maggie and Cal's, while respecting the history of the Double D. The horse breeding program continued to thrive, with Devil's Lantern's first foals showing promise of their sire's spirit, but with more biddable temperaments. As October drew to a close, a date loomed on the calendar that Maggie had been approaching with mixed emotions: the 1-year anniversary of Harold's death. The traditional expectation would be for his widow to lead a solemn remembrance, perhaps visit the grave with flowers, certainly dress in black, and appear appropriately grieved. Maggie had other plans. "Are you sure about this?" Cal asked as they discussed her idea over breakfast a few days before the anniversary. "People will talk. Let them," Maggie replied with a smile. "Haven't they always?" On the morning of the anniversary, the Double D was busier than usual. Wagons and buggies began arriving early, bringing ranchers and townspeople who had received Maggie's invitations. Most came out of curiosity as much as anything else, wondering what the new Mrs. Rowan had planned for this unusual occasion. They, were greeted not with the somber atmosphere they expected, but with tables set up on the lawn, decorated with autumn flowers and laden with food. Ranch hands directed visitors where to leave their vehicles, and Mrs. Peterson bustled about, making sure everything was in place. At precisely 10 o'clock, the front door of the ranch house opened. A collective gasp went up from the gathered crowd as Maggie stepped onto the porch. She wore not the black of mourning, but a dress of soft cream, similar to her wedding dress but simpler for everyday wear. Her hair was loose around her shoulders, adorned with a single red maple leaf. She looked nothing like the widow Duval they had known. This was Maggie Rowan, confident and radiantly alive. Cal waited for her at the bottom of the porch steps, Devil's lantern beside him. The stallion's saddle was polished to a high shine, and Cal himself was dressed in his best, his hat held respectfully in his hands. Maggie walked straight to him, her steps sure and steady. Taking his hand, she turned to face the assembled crowd. "Thank you all for coming today," she began, her voice clear in the morning air. "I know many of you expected a memorial service, a time to mourn and remember Harold Duval." A murmur ran through the crowd. Mrs. Winters looked particularly scandalized. "But today isn't about looking backward," Maggie continued. "It's about moving forward, about life, not death." She squeezed Cal's hand, drawing strength from his steady presence. "A year ago, I was a different woman, a widow who buried a man I didn't love, trapped in a life that wasn't truly mine. Today, I stand before you as a woman who has found her own path, who has learned that it's never too late to begin again." Turned to look at Cal, her eyes filled with love. "Today I'd like to celebrate not what was lost, but what has been found. Not an ending, but a beginning." Turning back to the crowd, she continued with quiet conviction. "I'd like to celebrate a man who earned his place in my life by never trying to tame me, only to stand beside me, who showed me that true partnership isn't about ownership or control, but about respect and trust." Cal's eyes glistened with emotion as she spoke, his hand tightening around hers. "So I've invited you all here today not for a memorial, but for a celebration of life, of love, of new beginnings." There was a moment of stunned silence, then Frank began to clap. Others joined in, slowly at first, then with gathering enthusiasm, until the applause rolled across the yard like thunder. Not everyone approved, of course. Mrs. Winters and a few others of her ilk departed shortly after Maggie's speech, tight-lipped with disapproval. But most stayed, drawn in by the unexpected joy of the occasion and the evident happiness of the hostess. Throughout the day, Maggie moved among her guests with a confidence she'd never shown during Harold's lifetime. She discussed breeding plans with neighboring ranchers, laughed with the townswomen who had once gossiped about her, and introduced Cal not as her new husband, but as her partner in all things. Cal, for his part, matched her step for step. Where once he had been the quiet stable boy, now he was a man who had found his place, not by taking over another man's position, but by creating his own alongside the woman he loved. As the celebration wound down and the last guests departed, Maggie and Cal stood on the porch, watching the sun set over their land. "You were magnificent today," Cal said, his arm around her waist. "I don't think Clearwater will ever be the same." Maggie laughed. "Good. It was time for some things to change around here." "Are you happy, Maggie Rowan?" Cal asked, echoing the question he'd asked on their wedding day. She turned to face him, her hands coming to rest on his chest. "More than happy, Cal. I'm free. To love you, to build our life together, to be exactly who I am." "And who is that?" he asked, his eyes tender as they searched her face. "A woman who's still discovering herself," Maggie replied thoughtfully. "But who knows for certain that she's exactly where she belongs?" Cal pulled her close, his kiss a promise and a seal on the words they'd shared. As the last light faded from the sky, they stood together on the threshold of the home they had made, looking out over the land they would shape together. Behind them in the barn, Devil's lantern nickered softly to his new companions, 2 mares heavy with his foals, the first of many to come. In the paddock nearby, a half-built fence marked the beginning of expanded breeding facilities, a joint project that would occupy the winter months ahead. And beyond the boundaries of the Double D, just over the North Ridge, lay 20 acres of untouched possibility, land that belonged solely to Cal and Maggie Rowan, where someday they might build a home of their own, a true fresh start. But for now, this moment was enough, standing together, as equals, partners in every sense, their future stretching before them as wide and promising as the land itself. Maggie leaned her head against Cal's shoulder, contentment settling deep in her bones. The wild stallion had been tamed with patience and respect, and in that same way Maggie had found not a cage, but freedom, not submission, but partnership, not merely a husband, but a love worth waiting for. "Come inside, Mrs. Rowan," Cal said softly. "Tomorrow's a new day." Hand in hand, they walked into their home, closing the door on the past and stepping fully into the future they would create together. The end.